Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, A Dog's Nose Knows. My name is Laura Cruzada. I'm the Public Involvement Specialist and Tribal Liaison for the Texas Department of Transportation's Environmental Affairs Division. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me, and if you can't, please type into the chat box and we'll try to get you squared away. But we really appreciate you guys joining us today. October is Texas Archaeology Month, if you didn't know. And so we're so excited that you're here to dig deeper into TxDOT's use of cadaver dogs on projects throughout the state. I'm joined today by TxDOT archaeologist Jen Anderson, as well as Dr. Ben Alexander. He's the Canine Training Coordinator for the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State. And we'll introduce them and their topics in a moment, but we wanted to take care of a few housekeeping items. Just wanted to make sure before I move on that y'all can hear me. Great. First and foremost, we hope that everyone is safe and well. We know things are difficult and challenging right now with the pandemic. At TxDOT, we're continuing to do business with many of us still teleworking and trying to navigate this new virtual world. Work in the field and on sites continues on a very limited basis right now. But we do appreciate all of our consultants and staff who are still able to work on our archaeological sites. We appreciate your time and attention, and we hope that today's webinar goes off without a hitch technically, so please bear with us as we are still trying to navigate how this virtual meeting setup works. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that the webinar does include a PowerPoint presentation, so if you're only joining us by phone, let us know and we can work with you to get a copy of the presentation after today. We'll also be recording this presentation and it will be available on the TxDOT website as well as our YouTube page following today's presentation. We'll send out information about that on our newsletter, through your various listservs, or through our website, TxDOT.gov, keyword search archaeology. We'll address your questions throughout the presentation. If it is about technical requirements, please type them into the Q&A box. We'll save questions about the main presentation until the end. In addition, we'll be asking some questions to get your feedback on our work, so use the chat function to respond to those. So today our agenda is going to include a little bit of information from myself about what TxDOT does in terms of our archaeology work and why we do that work and how it pertains to your communities. We'll then go into some of our upcoming projects briefly and how we can preserve the stories that we're learning through these archaeological sites and how you can get involved. And then we'll go into our main presentation about canine archaeologists and answer questions at the very end. We aim to wrap up and adjourn by 11:30 a.m. If you've joined us before, this won't be new to you, but we'll now go into a little bit more detail about what TxDOT archaeology does and why. And so when I talk to a lot of people from the public and some of our more even interested stakeholders, I ask them what they think about TxDOT. And usually what they say is they think about construction and traffic and delays. And I'm not going to lie, you know, when I'm driving down the road, I think about that too. But it's usually a surprise for people to hear that we do archaeology work. And when I do tell them, they are surprised and delighted because they don't know that TxDOT does more than construction. In fact, we've got teams of archaeologists and historians, as well as environmental scientists, who work with our engineers every day to plan around the state's historic and natural cultural resources before we build roads and bridges. In fact, TxDOT accounts for 40% of the permitted archaeology in the state, and that's actually more than any other organization or entity in the state. In the past 18 years, we've excavated or dug up roughly 31 major archaeological sites in Texas. We have 11 archaeologists on staff that look at how construction projects might affect archaeological sites in the right-of-way. We're often partnering with other consultants to work on archaeology projects, and these statistics that you see here reflect some of our program highlights from 2019. We'll soon be wrapping up the 2020 year, and we'll do some outreach on these same different statistics by the end of the year, so stay tuned. Now, I do public involvement and outreach as well as tribal consultation for TxDOT's archaeology program. I'm not an archaeologist. Our program is part of the Environmental Affairs Division that deals with cultural resources management. So what are cultural resources? Cultural resources are the historic places and spaces that make your communities unique. So your bridges and buildings, as well as archaeological sites and more. TxDOT builds roads and bridges, and while we do that, our archaeologists and historians are reviewing how these transportation projects might affect Texas's history, heritage, and cultural environment. Cultural resources can include buildings and bridges, archaeological sites and cemeteries, sacred or religious landmarks and sites to tribes, and historic objects and landscapes. For today's webinar, we'll specifically be focusing on archaeological sites and cemeteries. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into why we do the work that we do. TxDOT's work is guided by federal laws like the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. These laws require TxDOT to stop, look, and listen before starting construction. So all of this work happens years before we even break ground. It's part of a planning process that takes a lot of time and effort on our part. Under the National Historic Preservation Act and NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, TxDOT works with many partners to study different effects to our environment, such as noise, air, water quality, endangered plants and animals, archaeological sites, historic properties, neighborhoods, parks, and communities before starting each transportation project. Now, just because a building or bridge or other type of structure is old, it doesn't mean it gets preserved. It doesn't mean it's historic. Preserved has a different meaning under our regulations, as does the word historic. So if a property or a place or a structure is deemed significant enough to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and it'll be negatively impacted by TxDOT's construction, we must find a way to preserve its story. That can happen in many ways, and that'll be decided in consultation with partners, and depending on the construction project, which is managed by the district engineers and planners, we can find very creative preservation outcomes. This concept is called mitigation. In terms of archaeological sites, one way we mitigate or preserve the information and history is by excavating it and then sharing what we have found. And not all archaeological sites we encounter meet the standards under the federal laws to be preserved. The main thing about what we do that I want you to take away, though, is that it's a process and it requires your input. The historic preservation process is outlined in the regulations, and when we start our work to search for historic and archaeological sites, we call this Section 106 because it is literally Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. I'll go into a few of these steps so you can start to get familiar with how we carry out historic preservation. And we want you to also get used to the term Section 106 because that's what we call it. So as you can see on the screen, there are 4 steps to Section 106, and TxDOT follows all of these steps, but sometimes they happen concurrently. But the very, very first step of Section 106 is that we'll notify you when a project starts and might have impacts to cultural resources. We'll ask you in our communication if you have an interest in the project location, so where we're actually doing the project, and if you would like to participate in our process. The process includes identifying whether the sites in the project have any archaeological sites or other environmental resources. And we might ask you if you know of any other resources in the area and what might be important for us to consider. Step 3 in the Section 106 process is to evaluate the sites. So we work with federally recognized tribes as well as the Texas Historical Commission to see if that archaeological site is significant. And we might ask you if you have expertise that you want to share or historical facts that contribute to the evaluation of these sites. And if you remember, like I said about 5 minutes ago, that not every site is significant enough to be preserved, and this step is really important in us determining that. The last step in Section 106 is to decide how to balance preservation with progress. So in most cases, we need to find a way to mitigate or, like I said, make up for the fact that our project might impact this archaeological or historic site. The way we do that for archaeological sites is through what we call data recovery or excavation. And then we work with you to find other ways to share that story through outreach and education. So like I said, when we find unique sites, we might create brochures, short videos, podcasts, and posters. And we do this as part of our larger environmental campaign called Beyond the Road. We want to share the stories that make Texas unique, and this campaign allows us to bring those stories to you. And if you haven't heard about Beyond the Road, or if you want to learn more, go to www.TxDOT.gov, keyword search Beyond the Road, and you can read some of our stories, learn about our discoveries, and see about what some of our other environmental scientists are up to. And as I mentioned, under Section 106, TxDOT works with not just tribes in the Texas Historical Commission, but people like you and the public who have a vested interest in our sites. This can include county historical commissions, any Texas master naturalist groups, landowners, property owners, businesses, and other people who might be affected by the project. And we work together with these groups to come up with ideas for that outreach campaign. And like I said, that can include brochures, videos, oral histories, and more. I'll go into a little bit more now about what it means to be part of this process as a formal consulting party. Now, regulations that we work under dictate how we scale our effort for each resource, and so we might do more public involvement and outreach depending on the type of archaeological site we're working with. But no matter what, you can be a part of the process as a consulting party. And if you don't want to be a formal consulting party, you can just participate as a member of the public or an interested party. Now, consulting parties have a pretty specific role in our process, as I mentioned, the 4 steps, but we want to make sure that you understand that the main thing is to respond to us in a timely manner at each step of the process. We definitely need a commitment from consulting parties to contribute to those steps and be responsive to our timelines and the project's overall outcome. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to be asking for your feedback during this meeting because we have several sites that we're working on. But I wanted to go over a few examples of mitigation ideas that TxDOT has employed over the last couple years to kind of spur your creativity and thought as you respond to us. In El Paso, we had impacts to one of the oldest neighborhoods along the border called Chihuahuita. We had a bridge that actually towered over this 250-year-old neighborhood, and interestingly, the effects to that neighborhood were visual because the lights on the bridge shined down on this really historic neighborhood and changed the look and feel and the historic significance of the neighborhood. And so we worked with the neighborhood association and other people in the community to come up with ways to mitigate or compensate for the fact that our project was going to negatively impact where they lived. And they had a really, really small community feel, and you could tell as soon as you drove onto the streets of Chihuahua, which spanned about 2 blocks. It really, literally felt like you were driving into the past and a part of Mexico. And so we worked with the neighborhood to come up with ideas on how to share the story about Chihuahua. They decided, and we decided with them, to create a publication and poster that would talk about Chihuahua's history, about the architecture of the buildings and how the people lived all the way from the early parts of the neighborhood's history until today. And so we created this publication called A Journey Through Chihuahua, and we distributed it to schools and the museum, the local history museum, and a library, so that people could understand, why this neighborhood was so special. As part of our Beyond the Road outreach program, TxDOT co-hosted a special event in September during Hispanic Heritage Month, where we invited people to come to the museum and to the library to participate in different art and cultural activities while also educating about Chihuahua. In Waxahachie in Ellis County, we were mitigating for the replacement of a historic bridge as well as an archaeological site under that bridge. And we created exhibit panels that'll be displayed in a city park nearby. So we partnered with the city to get that done. And we had various panels describing the history of the bridge as well as the history of Native Americans in the area and other topics. And so, like I said, when we talk about mitigation, there are several questions we like to brainstorm with people. And if you're on this webinar, you should have completed the survey, which asks you some similar questions to the ones that you see on screen. And so since everyone is on mute, I'd like you to use the chat box to answer these questions so that we can start to create some new products and ideas for the sites that we're mitigating right now. And while you do this, I'll introduce our main presentation speakers. But if you want to learn more about the sites that we're working on in the next several months, go to TxDOT.gov and search archaeology. You can click on our current programs and projects, and you'll see fact sheets about the different sites in Mill County, Cummins County, and Anderson County that we're working on. And I will tell you, this is a banner year for TxDOT Archaeology. We are working on so many projects, and we look forward to getting your feedback on the type of information that we should share and what tools would contribute to the most effective program, or what educational products we should create as part of our mitigation. And so please, while I'm speaking, just answer the questions in the chat and we'll record your answers and then move on. And you can do this at any point during the presentation. So for the main presentation, Dr. Ben Alexander from the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State University and TxDOT's archaeologist Jen Anderson will discuss the training and use of cadaver dogs on archaeological projects throughout the state. In one case, the dogs helped TxDOT locate burials from about 5,200 to 1,000 years old. TxDOT first started using cadaver dogs at the request of federally recognized tribes that we work with every day during the Section 106 process. They are one of our main consulting parties on archaeological projects as outlined in the national regulations, and we also consult with them on a government-to-government basis since they are recognized by the federal government as sovereign nations. Tribes have an inherent interest in archaeological sites based on their indigenous, ancestral, and historic ties to the land. And while only 3 tribes reside in Texas now, we consult with 27 federally recognized tribes who have interests and ties to various areas of Texas. As you can imagine, encountering such sacred sites during our field work, like burials and graves, is a priority for TxDOT and for tribes both. And I won't go into all of the technical details of how that is done, but we will soon be producing webinars to go into our field techniques if you want to learn more. So stay tuned for those as well. What I do want to impart is that as part of Section 106, we've heard concerns from tribes that they wanted us to take a less destructive approach to searching for burials and graves in our project areas. And just like we would ask any of you, if you were to become a consulting party, what your feedback is on a project, we ask tribes for their consultation on projects as well. Tribes specifically asked for TxDOT to use cadaver dogs to search for burials, and so we did that, and our research today reflects that effort. There are other federal and state laws that we comply with when we do find burials, but I won't go into that because we want to make sure to get to our main presentation. But if you want to learn more, again, visit our website, and we'll be posting webinars on all these things. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ben Alexander of the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State University. And Ben, if you're on, you need to unmute yourself.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Laura. So I am the training coordinator at Texas State. Commonly, they refer to that as the body farm. It's one of 5 body farms in the United States. And I started that while I was working on my PhD doing research on soil and human body decomposition and cadaver dogs. And we've been successfully holding seminars there now we are in our 7th year. We started in 2013. Okay, next slide. So why dogs? Why do we use dogs to search for human remains, period? Well, we've been using dogs for our use for thousands of years. And their noses, although we may not have scientific quantification thousands of years ago, our ancestors figured out that their noses worked a lot better than ours did. We use dogs for tracking our food, for keeping enemies out of our camps, for protecting our livestock, and this was because the dogs had better visual acuity as well as better nose capabilities than what we do. It's often said dogs have an olfactory sensors that are 10,000 times better than humans. The most sensitive instrument that we've been able to measure a dog thus far tests them out at 1 part per trillion. That's simply because that's the most sensitive we can go right now. They could very well be much more sensitive than that. So what are the dogs smelling when they're smelling human remains? Well, the honest answer is we really don't know. Part of my research was trying to find that missing link to say this is it, so that we could train dogs perhaps with some kind of better prepared pseudo scent. Unfortunately, we were not able to determine that, and many other researchers have been doing the same thing without any success for many years. What we do know is that they can detect fatty acids. They can detect what we call volatile organic compounds, and fatty acids seems to be one of the main ones that they respond to, and can also be found in something that's known as adipocere or corpse wax, kind of like how fat will kind of turn into a soap-like material on the corpse. A lot of it depends on anaerobic conditions and the soil microbes and the type of soil, but it also preserves the bodies better. One thing that we noticed when we were working at the body farm was the odor that we encountered when we would walk through into the facility. Before we started working at the body farm, training cadaver dogs in Texas was very difficult because our law was very ambiguous about what we were allowed to obtain, and a lot of medical examiners, doctors, coroners, and so forth were reluctant to help you out. So the main thing that people trained on was placentas and maybe teeth and bone obtained off of the internet. There are actually 2 internet stores, Skulls Unlimited in Oklahoma and one store out in California. But we also began to get lipo from some doctors. And one of the first things that I noticed when I went in there to collect soils for my research projects was that there was a very strong similarity between the odor of the lipo and the overall smell of the facility. So some of the research that's being done currently is looking at fat as it basically leaches down into the rock, into the soil. And in Texas, one of the ongoing studies that's being done, we've found that at about 30 centimeters, the fat becomes recalcitrant, and it just doesn't, once it degrades to a certain point, it doesn't degrade anymore. So it's very possible that the fatty acids are something that the dogs are really being able to key in on. Okay, next slide. So we also know through research that the chemicals are transported through groundwater and runoff. There's been several studies done where they actually tested the chemicals down slope of graves and found there to be a high concentration. The steeper the slope, the higher the concentration. And there's also been many anecdotal scenarios with actual cases for clandestine graves where the dogs would alert at the bottom of a hill, but the grave was actually up on the side of the hill, and they had to work basically backwards to be able to locate it, because what the dogs respond to isn't necessarily the remains. They respond to the highest concentration of odor molecules. Okay. We also know that groundwater flows through the easiest pathways, okay, and it's also taken up by plants. So one of the projects that I did was looking at uptake of plants, and again, we could not produce a smoking gun of, okay, this is what they smell, but what we did find was that when you took the same plant, primarily trees, and you took samples from next to a buried body versus a plant that was in the same area but not right next to the body, so it wouldn't have been taking up chemicals, the dogs were generally 85% or better in being able to identify which plant cuttings came from near a body. The interesting part of that, though, was that even though we couldn't come up with a smoking gun, we did come up with the analogy that the more changes from baseline, so the more chemical changes from the control plants, the higher the degree of accuracy that the dogs showed. And in this particular picture, we're working in a trench, and that's my canine Rip, and she's actually keyed in on a root that's been busted, and it actually was leaking water. She did give an alert on that, and in that particular area, upslope was supposed to be an actual burial mound that was identified by the owner of the land, but it was outside of TxDOT's right-of-way, so we couldn't actually go up there. But we've also seen this in cemeteries where dogs will actually alert on trees that are next to the graves versus on the actual grave themselves. Okay, next slide. So I've been training dogs for about 40 years. I started when I was a kid with my parents' German Shepherds, and I started training scent detection dogs 20 years ago in 2000. Rip is my 5th canine partner, and she's actually a 3rd-generation search dog. So her granddaddy was actually my first search and rescue partner. So genetically, she was selected because she genetically carried what we were looking for. But what do we look for when we're looking for a search and rescue dog? A lot of people think that because a dog can smell, that any dog can do this. and that's really not correct. It takes a very specialized dog to do scent detection. A lot of the dogs, well, the majority of the dogs that we use that are successful and competent dogs in the field are not a dog that you would want to have at home as a pet. They are more personality-wise like police dogs, not in an aggressive manner, but in a manner that they have to have a job or they will become very destructive in the home. Border Collies, if anybody out there has them, knows that Border Collies, if you don't give them a job, they will make up jobs. Okay? So the things that we look for in the right dog is that they are genetically healthy. You don't want to waste your time training a dog for 2 years to have them have some major medical problem come up when they're 4 years old and you have to retire them. There's a lot of time and money that's put into these dogs. They have to have something that we call nerve strength, which is a field term for very courageous and fearless. It means that it doesn't matter where you take them. They can get out of the car and immediately go to work. You'll see this in your FEMA dogs. These dogs fly across the country. They get off a plane in Haiti and they go straight to work in a disaster situation. This is the kind of dog that we want. Okay. They have to be highly motivated, so they have to have what we call a high drive for a toy. We don't use dogs that will only work for food. Okay? There's a great misconception out there that these dogs need to be very slow and sluggish to be successful in their work, and that's just simply not true. The dogs that we've found most successful at locating clandestine graves, surface remains, any type of human remains in disaster situations has been dogs that are highly motivated by toys, and so that's something that we look for. We use the toy as their reward or their paycheck, and you have to have that to be able to manipulate to be able to get good performance. And they have to have the physical capability of stamina, so you couldn't use a dog that had poor stamina. In terms of training, as I said, in the old days, we wouldn't have a lot of options for training aids. Now we do because of Texas State and because of a new state law allowing qualified teams to actually lease sources from the Will Donor Program out of Fort Worth and Dallas. And so we train these dogs to find the particular odor of human remains. And the way we do that is through association. So through through target odor equals reward. So if any of you have ever heard of operant conditioning, that's what we're doing. We do not use any kind of pseudo scent here because of legal potential problems. Our legal system would not look kindly on pseudo scent in the court because it would give defense attorneys an opportunity to basically get the evidence thrown out in evidentiary hearings because they can cast doubt on the dog's capabilities. So you will not find handlers in the United States using any kind of pseudos or substitute scents. Now, if you go to Europe or to Great Britain, they can use pig or pseudos without any problems because their laws are a little bit different than ours. So here in the U.S., we use the real thing. Okay, next slide. Okay, so Rip, however, was trained a little bit differently than all my other partners were. All my other partners were started on standard bone and maybe a little bit of lipo and placenta and whatever we could get. Rip, however, was started after we had access to the body farm, and we actually did her first introduction on whole bodies at Texas State, which was interesting because she was a pretty young dog. She was about 8 months old, but she had all the factors that I talked about on the previous slide, and we did not have any problems with her showing any kind of aversion or anything to the bodies. We also have burieds at the body farm that are whole body burials, and we know the exact age of them. At the time, I had a partner who was several years older than Rip, who was very successful in clandestine graves. And so you work your young dogs in there after you've worked your older dog to determine where the odors are being emitted at that particular time of day. And it does change through the course of the day. On this particular grave, we were training because it was underneath a tree. And so as it heats up, the odor tends to come out higher and higher in the treetop. Once we had her working really good on the whole body burial there at Fax, then we began training at Eloise Natural Cemetery, which is outside of Bastrop, which is what we call a green cemetery. The owner there is very supportive of training cadaver dogs, and we schedule trainings with her and take the dogs over. We had an opportunity there to work her on graves that were anywhere from a couple of weeks old up to 10 years old, and now I think they're up to 13 or 14 years old because of how the length that the location has been in open. These are working whole bodies, though, but for cold cases, it's hard to train dogs for because we know that the threshold starts to lower. And when I talk about threshold, it's kind of hard to describe to people, so I'll describe it like this. When we view the world, humans are very visual, okay? So we see the world, but dogs smell the world. Threshold is kind of like this. If you look at food coloring, all of them basically look black when they're in their little bottles, right? You can have red, green, and blue, but they all look kind of black. It isn't until you take that bottle out and you drop into water, you can actually see the real color. For dogs, bodies tend to be the same thing. When you train them on little bitty parts, like the drop in the water, the bottles of concentration can sometimes be a problem for dogs. With Rip, we started the opposite directions. We actually trained her on the concentration first, and then were able to put her on little drops, which made her much better at working cold cases. However, the more that you work a cold case, the older that you get asked to work. So I began to use ceramic balls to absorb odor so that I could lower her threshold even more and use those to train her for cold cases. The balls were put in with, we'll talk about the balls in a second. We also did training on pre-Civil War and pre-embalming sites. I try to stay away from embalmed bodies because of the chemicals and the potential for inhalant hazards to her nose, possibly causing cancer. We've seen that in some dogs. And we've trained on pioneer cemeteries that were in the 1800s. The problem that you get into there is that you get lots and lots of graves in one area, and it's like stepping into an elevator with someone with too much cologne on. It takes them a few minutes to be able to settle out and locate the odor. Okay, next slide. So when I was asked to do this, initially I thought we were looking for a historic grave, so a couple 100 years old. And I was pretty comfortable with that. I had no idea that we were actually going to be looking for prehistoric graves. And one of the problems that we have is there's really no way to train her for that. There are no sites that I can just take her and work her at, and there's no way to possess anything to train her on. Dogs can only find the odors that they're trained to find. And human remains with contemporary remains, we know, have over 487 chemicals that are released during decomposition, and they're not even all released at the same time on every body. So it's a constantly changing picture to be able to get them to recognize all stages of decomp and all types of decomp in the many different variants that can be presented over the course of decomposition. We always say that cadaver dogs are much harder to train than drug dogs or bomb dogs because our job never ends. This 487 chemicals or more or less is constantly rotating and constantly changing, whereas with a bomb dog, you have about 16 odors at your primaries. And with narcotic dogs, you have 3 to 5. So there's a huge difference in maintenance training for the lifetime of the dog. Okay, next slide. So the pie weights that we were talking about a minute ago. So these are ceramic weights. They are actually used for baking pies to keep the crust from bubbling, but we found that we can put them in with human remains, and with direct contact, they will absorb the odor. We do not have success with non-direct contact or really dry remains. They don't do very well with, but with anything that's a little bit wet, it works really, really well. And they're easier to carry around also than taking human remains sometimes with you, because you have to have those stored outside your vehicle, and it can be a real pain sometimes. But it has been very helpful in training the dogs for locating clandestine graves. One of the things we also do is we put them into soil substrates and allow them to absorb the odor of cadaver soil. The issue there is that we've always got to have negatives from soil that does not have cadaver remains, because you don't want to teach the dogs to just alert on an anomaly. You want them to actually alert on the odor of human remains. Okay, next slide. So this is just a very quick clip of her doing training at the house. My fiance fussed at me yesterday because I was in t-shirts and shorts wearing it, but it's just to kind of give you guys the idea. She has what's called a passive alert, which means that it's non-destructive. Hers is a down. Passive alerts generally involve either sit, down, or bark at the odor. Okay, so you want to see if you can play it? Yeah. Okay, so I always start her out in the down, which lets her know that we're looking for something that is what we call low and slow, which means slow down and keep your nose on the ground. And also she responds to my pace, so the faster I walk, the faster she covers ground. If I go slower, she slows down and covers ground slower. And I apologize for the choppiness of the video. Okay, so there she is. She's alerted on the odor. And what we're working on, you're always working on the various aspects of training, and then by making her stay there, I'm working on making sure that she stays committed to the odor until I get there to give her her reward, which her reward is a tennis ball on a rope. Okay, next slide. Now, this is a real short clip of actually working in a cemetery. It's just so you can see her body language. Notice her tail is up over her back. She's very excited because there's odor basically everywhere, and it's giving a hard time. Let's see if it'll actually play through this time. Okay, notice that she sits. That is not her trained final response. She's sitting next to a tree in the middle of all the graves, and remember we talked about plant uptake. This is her signal to me that means I have odor everywhere. And now she goes and she keys in on an actual ground area. There's a little headstone right to the left of that. All the graves that were in that area were mid-1800 graves in a historic cemetery in Robertson County. And this is actual mission footage from a search. And notice her tail is curled up over her back again. This is means that she is excited. And a lot of times, and you probably wouldn't be able to see it in this video because of its choppiness, but a lot of times when she gets an odor, her tail will also start to wag. So we do watch their body language a lot as well. She sat just like she did in the other video. Okay, I've got odor. I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of odor here. Can't figure out where it's coming from. This particular area was kind of a berm at the base of a long hill where we had multiple alerts up the hill. So it's possible that what she was alerting on in that was actual runoff and not actually graves. Now, the one thing that we have been able to do with Rip twice is take her over to Caddo Mound State Park. The rangers there have been extremely kind and allowed me to bring her in and work her twice on the burial mound. However, you know, one of the issues is that dogs, contrary to popular belief, have pretty good memory. When we train at regular locations with these dogs, they recognize where they're going and they get excited and they know where they're at. If you put a hide in a place 2 months ago and you turn them loose in the same area to work, even though they use their nose, they will cheat a little bit and go back and check where the hide was 2 months ago to make sure it's not still there. And depending on what kind of hide it was, there could be a little bit of residual odor if it was a wet hide. So I probably can get away with taking her maybe one more time here before she actually starts to recognize and do this by memory instead of doing it by odor. The first time we took her in directly from the parking lot, directly to the mound. The second time I actually walked around all the trail, all the way around, and came in from the backside. And when we were about 150 yards downwind, she gave me a sit alert, again telling me I'm getting odor. I don't know exactly where it's coming from, and then we worked into the actual mound. Again, you know, it's important that these dogs are trained with what we call passive alerts so that they are non-invasive. There are dogs still trained in search and rescue that do scratch alerts and so forth, or refines where they run back and forth. And some of those dogs can get pretty aggressive with their alert and do a little bit of damage to things. All right, next slide, please. I think that may be it. That's it. So hopefully, as we continue, Rip will get better at this. We continue to train her, and I'm also training 2 younger dogs to follow up behind her with pretty much the same methods that I used to train Rip versus the contemporary methods of training cadaver dogs with much smaller training aids. Thank you very much. And at this time, I'd like to turn it back over to Laura or to Jennifer.
Thank you, Ben. And Jennifer, I have your presentation up on screen if you want to scroll through the arrows.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Ben for his presentation about the dogs and how he trains them, and also thank him for agreeing to work with us at TxDOT to train the dogs and to find burials that are considerably older than what he's used to. And thanks also to Laura for organizing the talk. We hope that you leave here today with a better understanding of what we're doing here at TxDOT and what field applications are best for the dogs. We are constantly updating and adapting our training protocols for the dogs, so we don't have the training completely ironed out yet, but we feel confident that with the right training, both for the dogs and for the handlers, that the dogs are capable of locating older human remains. So as Laura mentioned earlier, at the tribe's request for more non-invasive survey methods for identifying human remains, TxDOT began incorporating cadaver sniffing dogs into searches within the TxDOT right-of-way. That was back in 2019. Cadaver dogs have been successfully able to identify 8th century burials in Europe and mid to late 19th century burials in the western United States. Although the use of cadaver dogs isn't really widely known about or used for archaeological applications, We understand that the dogs are capable of doing this, and our results have been pretty promising. We definitely understand that we need to work on a better, more standardized methodology for its application. But as we implement more prehistoric and early historic scent training, we believe that the dog's detection abilities will increase. And also, as we gain a better understanding of their capabilities in different landscapes, our understanding of when best to utilize the dogs will increase. Our initial studies that we've done so far have had mixed results, but the results and lessons learned are promising for the future. So our first application for using the dogs was a site in Nueces County, 41 NU 114. This was an ideal testing ground because TxDOT had already committed to using GPR to survey the area and to systematically machine excavating the soil a few inches at a time to identify burials. So these additional methods provided a check on the accuracy of the dog's detection abilities. And despite the massive area that the dogs covered at the site, they actually only hit on a couple of areas. The GPR results from this site were inconclusive, likely due to the clay substrate that they were working with. And the mechanical excavation at the site revealed that the areas that the dogs hit on actually did contain human remains. So as a result of these efforts, TxDOT was able to arrange to alter the project design to avoid the burials, and the burials were left in place and capped with 5 inches of concrete to avoid future damage or erosion. Initially, we thought that this particular site would be hard for the dogs to detect the odor for much the same reason that the GPR was unsuccessful, due to the clay substrate. But as it turns out, it worked. And in fact, further investigation and talking with Ben, we actually think that the clay likely preserved the odor better than a sandy substrate would due to the less desiccation. So another case study that we did here at TxDOT was in Crane County. And this one was a little bit different because the site had already been subject to hand excavations, and a human tooth was identified in a 1-by-1 unit, and the tooth was fully excavated, documented, and removed prior to us bringing the dogs on site. So once we brought the dogs on site, the dogs alerted on the area where the tooth was found. So this was, of course, suggesting that there was a scent profile associated with the human remains there. And this was a good ground truthing moment for the dog's abilities to detect human remains. The dogs were then taken across the site, and she alerted on the dune crest, which is at the northern boundary of the site. And a bone fragment was found later, approximately 5 meters downslope from where the dog alerted. And then a third bone fragment was found to the south of the excavation block, but the dog hadn't alerted there. So, of course, we think we need to do further research to understand exactly why the dogs didn't alert in this area. But our preliminary speculations include, first and foremost, the nature of the sandy substrate and dune morphology. This is in a dune field out in Crane County. So it makes pinpointing the exact location of the human remains difficult. So think about in Ben's talk when he was saying that the scent is transported through groundwater. Think about how easily groundwater can be transported through sand. The sand is very porous, and it allows the scent to disperse far and wide. And the further the scent gets away from the source, the less concentrated it can be. So it's more difficult to detect. But something that we did learn through this site as well is that sand is not a complete deal breaker. The wider the scent spreads across the site, the more likely that the dog is to detect it. It's just that she wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly where the burial is. So it's good for confirming presence or absence. So another problem that we had at the site may be related to the time of day that the dogs investigated the site. This site was examined in the morning because of excessive heat warnings in the afternoon. And now, well, I think Ben probably knew this all along, but now we're starting to realize that the scent detection works the best when it's hot and the scent has had time to sort of bake in the soil, so that it can actually, the scent can permeate through the soil up to the ground surface. And then finally, an issue that we might have is just simple human error. The handler needs to be conscientious of examining all areas of the site and not just areas where the burials are presumed to be. So, for example, letting go of preconceived notions of protocols that may apply only to modern clandestine graves. Another case study that we had was in Starr County, and this particular site was an investigation for a more recent, early to mid 20th century burial. This gentleman was rumored to be interred within the TxDOT right-of-way, and a grave marker was placed in the area where his burial was suspected, but the marker was placed later without any confirmation of where the body was actually interred. So TxDOT investigators needed to know if the local lore was true and if there was in fact a burial within the right-of-way. So the dogs were called out to investigate the area of the site. The dogs searched the entire APE and really only alerted on vegetation to the south of the grave marker, which is depicted like off camera to the right of this image. And although it wasn't a direct hit, it did alert investigators that a burial was in fact present on the property. So although this study wasn't exactly, a success, some of the things that we learned from it is that first and foremost, temperature plays a critical role in the dog's ability to detect scent. On this particular site, you can see Ben's wearing a jacket. It was in the 40s that day. And now we know that the scent needs time in the sun to essentially like water evaporation. It permeates the soil and then is translocated outside of the soil to the ground surface. This typically, it can happen, like Ben discussed, through vegetation. So the fact that she alerted on vegetation out to the south of the burial makes sense, and it was actually downslope. So again, that is probably the reason why she didn't actually pinpoint the exact location of the burial. On this particular site, the burial was located, and it's going to be reinterred at a local cemetery and placed adjacent to the deceased relatives. So you can see the results of the investigations thus far have been mixed, but keep in mind that these 3 studies were conducted prior to any sort of training on prehistoric human remains. Nueces County was a success, though we thought the clay substrate would hinder the dog's abilities. Crane County was a half success. The dog successfully detected the known location of a human tooth and a bone fragment. However, she alerted on the dune crest, and the bone fragment was found at the base of the dune. And Starr County was also a partial success. The dog detected the correct odor profile, but failed to pinpoint the exact location of the burial. So all told, these studies show promising results without formal training on any older prehistoric and historic human remains. We're working towards getting the dogs trained using those pie weights that Ben mentioned in his talk. And hopefully we will have much greater success with detecting the distinct scent profile and also successfully pinpointing the location of prehistoric burials. It's clear that the results of the dog's alerts need to be interpreted within the context of the APE's landscape, including an assessment of the soil types present, the vegetation present, and how the slope may translocate or disperse the scent across the site. The most accurate alerts seem to be when there's a trench cut into the site and the dog can sniff beneath the ground surface, and the dog's accuracy increases considerably if the trench includes sappy roots that may have sucked up the scent along with the groundwater, and if the backhoe clips the root, which is what she's alerting on here in the trench. So TxDOT plans to continue our work with Dr. Alexander and training the cadaver sniffing dogs on the unique scent profile of prehistoric and early historic remains, and then also to develop a protocol for using the dogs on surveys within our right-of-way. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Jen and Ben. We'll now do our Q&A, and type your questions into the comment box and send it to host on the Q&A box, or you could send it through the chat. But I'll go through a few of the questions that we got over time, and Ben, Jen, and Scott, if y'all could unmute, I'll go through those now. So we had one question about what type of dog Rip is. It's an easy one for you, Ben.
Yeah, Rip is a border collie.
There we go. Okay, so second question is, do other scents that are attractive to our dogs ever attract your dog and interfere?
Yes. We are constantly, in our training, doing what we call proofing the dogs out of non-target odors. So, you know, like I said, we see the world, dogs smell the world. I equate it like this. If you were out in a large crowd of people before COVID and you saw someone that resembled a relative at a distance and you started walking towards them, but as you got close, you saw that it's not the person you thought they were, and then you moved on. Dogs do the same thing. They smell an odor of interest, they move towards it, they check it, and then they make a decision. This is either an odor that I was trained on or it's not, and then they move on. It's our job as trainers to make sure that we expose them to a variety of non-target odors so that when they are doing searches, that they only respond to odors that they've been trained for.
Great. The next question is, what if you just lost a tooth eating and you spit it out and then TxDOT finds it thousands and thousands of years later? Is that still considered a burial? And maybe, Scott, you can answer that question. You're on mute.
Yep. Thanks for the reminder, Laura. Yes, I can answer that question. That's a good question. And the short answer is that no, naturally shed human material such as fingernails, hair, and even teeth would not be considered a burial. And generally, from context, you could distinguish something like a naturally shed tooth from a human burial, because generally burials will occur in intentionally dug pits, and there may also be funerary objects placed with the burial that would also help you to identify and distinguish a burial from just naturally shed human material.
Thank you, Scott. All right, the next question is, how many dogs are trained in this way in Texas?
For the historic work, that would be Rip. As far as just cadaver dogs in general, that can vary anywhere between 50 to 100 any given year. Through local teams, nonprofit teams, and so forth across the state.
The next question is, once a dog locates a scent and lays down, how does the archaeologist know which way to search? Do they search all 4 directions? And maybe Scott or Jen, y'all can jump in.
I'll take this one, Scott. Whenever the dog alerts on a site, at a location at a site, we tend to examine the entire area. Right now, we're not exactly sure what her radius to read a site is. So we've been systematically sort of mechanically scraping the site to check for burial square she alert. But we're not, like I said, not exactly sure what her radius is yet.
Okay, and the last question actually came from one of our archaeologists who asked if we really, if the cadaver dogs really did find burials between 5,200 to 1,000 years old. And the answer is kind of. It was about, 4,200 to 1,100 years old in Nueces County. Okay, so we have another question. Would recently deceased specimens before perhaps much oil or fat has decomposed compare with 8th century burials?
Can you repeat that one?
It says, would recently deceased specimens before perhaps much oil or fat has decomposed compare with 8th century burials?
Oh, well, from my perspective, that's a very good question. We actually don't know the answer to that. It's something that I would love to see further investigation on, because it would be nice to know what exactly is remaining in the soil that the dogs are hitting on. I know that from soils that we took at FACS, we always got, no matter, even if the grave or the body that we were taking samples from was even like 3 or 4 years old, when we would, after we would shake the soil with water for 24 hours and then spin it, even if it was in one of the older soils, we would still get a thin cap of fat on the spin. And it would be interesting to see what would happen in a soil that's, 1,000, 2,000 years old.
I
know that doesn't really answer the question.
Okay. Laura and Ben, I have a few more questions for Ben.
Okay.
Ben, what is a natural cemetery? Is it a cemetery where the remains are not embalmed?
That's correct. If the one in Bastrop, they are not embalmed. They are not buried in any kind of structure. They're either put in naturally or wrapped in a shroud.
Do you take volunteers to help with the dogs? For context, the questioner says, I am an LVT here in Texas and a volunteer with the Wilco MRC.
We do take volunteers. We have not done that on the TxDOT outings just because we're still kind of in experimental stages in developing the protocols and everything. But yeah, and they're also, if they're interested, there are usually also local teams that they could get involved with to work on more contemporary cases.
Ben, how much obedience training do the dogs have other than sit, down, stay, come? Are they trained to heel and so forth?
I'm going to be real honest. I was an obedience instructor for 20 years and used to compete competitively. No. They are trained what we call functional obedience. She will come when called. She knows an emergency drop, which means if she's running along and there's some kind of a danger, I can yell down, and she's going to drop wherever she's at and stay until I can get to her. She knows sit and down and stay. But as far as actual healing, I really don't ask her to heal a lot. The more obedience that we tend to put on these dogs, the less independence that we have, and that can be a real detriment in the field. I want her to listen to her nose over me.
This is the last question that I have right now. Can the soil type affect the dog's ability to scent remains? Just thinking about the wide range of soil types across Texas and wondering how scents and chemical traces might change.
The answer to that is yes. Actually, one of the chapters in my dissertation is on soil type effect on burials. And we only tested 2 types just due to time constraints. But we did a clay soil versus a sandy soil, and we saw a big difference in the dog's ability to detect. Dogs, you generally can, as Jen was saying, they can detect the presence of odor in a sandy soil fairly easily. The problem is being able to pinpoint becomes very difficult for them in the sandy soil because of the porosity and the ability of the odor to spread. And if the soil is wet, that makes it even worse. Clay soils, the dogs have a harder time pinpointing or locating it, but if they are able to locate, their pinpoint is generally much more accurate in clay soils than it is in sandy soils. However, clay can interfere with just the ability for them to locate. I always relate it to people. If you think about what do we use to line the bottom of a stock pond? We use clay. We use clay so that it holds in the water, right? If you think about that reversed and you've got clay on top of a body, it is going to adhere a lot of the molecules that are coming off that body in decomposition, and you're only going to have molecules escaping via things like root holes, wormholes, and so it makes it much more difficult for the dogs to locate. However, thus far, we've had better success with RIP on clay soils than we have had sandy soils.
So related to the question about soils, can you go into a little bit more detail about why when it's hotter outside it might be easier for RIP to signal and pick up the scents?
Well, yeah. So as the sun heats the soil up, then you're going to have a greater release of molecules. That's the theory anyway. That you have a greater release of molecules, and so if you do have any routes for those to escape a clay soil, then you're going to have a much more condensed area of odor being emitted. Whereas with a sandy soil, as it heats up, because of the porosity, you could have, just for a grave, you might have a 50 by 50 foot area that's emitting the odor all at the same rate, which is going to make it very difficult for her to pinpoint exactly where the grave is. Is that kind of what you were talking about, Jen? And then as the grave cools off, then you start to have the same problems. So the one flip of that is that if you've got a lot of vegetation, a lot of times other individuals that I've trained with that are my mentors have had success in morning working the dogs when you have time periods of high glutation where the trees are basically leaking liquid out of their stomatas, presumably that has some kind of substance in it that the dogs can identify. We really don't know why they alert on trees, but in graveyards particularly, they'll alert on a tree before they will the grave.
Thank you. And someone wanted to know if they could access your dissertation, and maybe you could provide some instruction on how to do that through the chat box, or you could tell people now, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, Let me go grab the link from Texas A&M, and I'll put it in the chat box.
Okay, great. And so this last question we got about the Chihuahua project, and so I've asked Rebecca DeBrasco, who is our lead historian at TxDOT, to answer this question. And so someone wanted to know if TxDOT had considered alternative lights to have a lesser impact on the community.
Hi, yes, thanks for that question. We did consider alternative lights. We did install them. One of the things we considered for that project, for that elevated expressway, was installing lights. Typically we have like the high mast lights. Those are the ones that, tower over the roadway and light from above. But we considered installing lights like along the concrete barriers so they're closer to the ground. But that was not able to give us the amount of lighting that we needed to safely light that road. So in the taller high mast lights, we did install special bulbs that direct the lighting. It doesn't disperse it out, similar to the bulbs installed for lighting, when you're trying to preserve dark skies and things like that. So we did minimize some of the impacts on the neighborhood that way too, by using those directional lights.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. So this is another question for Ben. What is the oldest burial Rip has located?
Actually, maybe you or Scott would know. I'm not exactly sure.
I have a preliminary date on the Nueces County site of possibly around 3,500 BP.
BP meaning before present day.
Oh, thank you, Laura.
No problem. Scott, do you have any more questions in your chat box?
Nope, I think we covered it.
Okay, great. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time. That concludes our presentation for today. If you have additional questions that you'd like us to follow up on, feel free to send me an email, and my information is up on screen now. I also included my office number, which is being forwarded to my work cell phone number during our telecommute. If you want more information about our program, please visit www.TxDOT.gov, keyword archaeology. We're going to be hosting these roadside chat webinars as much as we can in the next several months, talking not just about archaeology, but we have a few other interesting topics along the way about tribal histories, about our wildlife crossings, and other projects from our public historians. If you have feedback about this presentation, please reach out to us. We love hearing from you. And if you have any other ideas about how we can share information through our Beyond the Road campaign as we mitigate sites, feel free to email them to me or put them in the chat box. Again, we got a lot of great feedback so far, and we can't do this without y'all. So as we continue to shape our program for the next few years, we've got to convince our partner agencies and regulators who help us comply with the National Historic Preservation Act that the work that we're doing is responsive to your community needs and what you want to see out of these educational and outreach programs. So thank you so much. And if you are interested in seeing Ben's dissertations, he's included those links in the chat. And so I'll leave those up for a few minutes after we end. And just a reminder that we'll post a recording of this presentation on our website, TxDOT.gov, keyword search archaeology. So thank you again. I hope everyone stays safe and well, and we'll see you on the next Roadside Chat. Have a great day.